it's one thing when a murder or some kind of physical injury is sustained. That's a crime in any society. But then when the perpetrator has official power and is immediately pardoned by the state that he works for, that's a kind of second problem where you feel like there's just no accountability.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this is Colloquy, bringing knowledge from the university's PhD community to top-of-mind issues. I'm Paul Massari. Armed troops in the streets of an American city. A leader in a faraway capital determined to exercise his power over the people there. Screams of protest from residents who demand the force's withdrawal, resistance, violence, and tragic deaths. These are the elements that made Boston the cauldron of the American Revolution in the 1770s. Are they playing out again in the United States today? And what are the limits of looking to history to better understand the current moment? Joining us to consider these and other questions about the use of state power then and now is the historian and author Ted Widmer. Formerly the distinguished lecturer at the Macaulay Honors College of the City University of New York, Widmer is the writer and editor of numerous books, including Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, winner of the prize for Best Book of the Year from the Lincoln Forum, and the inaugural prize for Best Book from the Society of Presidential Descendants, among other awards. From 1997 to 2001, Widmer served as speechwriter and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton, and senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton from 2012 to 2014. His piece, Boston in the 1770s, Minneapolis in 2026, appeared last January in the Ideas section of the Boston Globe. This year, Ted Widmer is the W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. He got his Ph.D. from Harvard Griffin GSAS in 1993. Ted Widmer, welcome to Colloquy.
Thank you, Paul. Great to be here.
So, you and I are sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now. We don't think of the Boston area as the site of a military occupation. That might be different if we were indigenous people. But of course it was, twice, actually, between 1768 and 1770, and from 1774 to 1776. What precipitated those occupations, and what were the goals of the British government in sending troops to Boston?
Well, thank you for having me. This was the red-hot center of resistance to British imperial overreach in the 1760s and 1770s. The British had paid a lot of money to win a war, and it was a war that Americans and English fought alongside each other. We call it the French and Indian War. The British call it the 7 Years' War, and it resulted in a victory over the French. It was fought around New England and Canada. And so everyone was happy, but then the British realized they'd spent a lot of money winning the war, and it had benefited these New Englanders, so they wanted to extract some money from them, and they began to do that by taxing them. And taxes have been around a long time, but they didn't settle well with New Englanders, who had a very keen sense of their political rights for reasons in their own history, going back to the founding of New England, when they were largely governing themselves for a long time. But as Parliament was trying new things, Parliament wasn't explaining its logic very well. New Englanders were trying hard to explain why they didn't feel like paying taxes if they were not represented in Parliament. And the struggle kept getting tenser year to year. There were small acts of violence around Boston in the mid-1760s. A new set of taxes called the Townshend Acts created in 1767, and Boston's just really unhappy. So the British, for the first of two times, send thousands of redcoats. New Englanders called them lobsterbacks, but British regulars are brought here and occupy the city of Boston, and it's a big mistake. It just drives the wedge in even deeper.
Something I've always been confused about with the outrage about taxes was that the people still thought of themselves as British citizens. And it wasn't the kind of representative government that we think of today, although there was Parliament. Why did they feel so strongly that Parliament had no right to tax them?
Well, they knew what representative government was. They had local representative government here in Boston and Cambridge, and nearly every Massachusetts town had a town meeting, but there's the General Court of Massachusetts. So they knew very well what it was to be assessed and to pay a tax and to be able to complain about it to your local representative. And they had none of those feelings when Parliament starts taxing them. They're thousands of miles away. Parliament has this argument that they are virtually represented, that all these people in London are thinking of them, but that wasn't real representation. That was the nub of the argument. And the New Englanders, you're right, they were quasi-English. They just didn't buy this weak argument. Parliament had moved the ball around, and New Englanders were good at following the ball, and they didn't like where this was all heading. It was heading toward a much more authoritarian government. And as these two occupations of Boston took place, it just made everything worse, because then you get into other kinds of violations of civil and political rights, including having a British soldier come into your house without a warrant. Mm-hmm. Things we're thinking about a lot right now in 2026. And so as this struggle is happening between Americans, New Englanders on the one side, and the English, the New Englanders were able to cite ancient English law very effectively. And the British had worked out over centuries a common law. Some of it is very ancient, Magna Carta, but a lot of it they worked out in the 17th century, and kings did not have unlimited power. And it was important to have a legal process, to have trial by jury, habeas corpus, all of these sacred legal rights that we think of as sacred American legal rights. Most of them go back to an older English law.
My understanding of what British government was like in the mid to late 18th century was fairly aristocratic and even authoritarian. The king had a lot more power than he does, say, today. When they thought of themselves as British citizens, even though they were over here, it seems to me that they wouldn't have had a whole lot of representation if they were still in Great Britain. So why did they feel like they could still call themselves British citizens, but somehow have the right to greater representation than they probably would have had they been in Britain?
Well, it's a great question. And I don't think all Americans felt the same level of being aggrieved. New Englanders were different. They were very focused on their political rights. As I said earlier, they had achieved a pretty high level of independence in their political affairs here, and they knew where they came from. They came from a group of people who had left England in the 1620s and 1630s and in the decades that followed, because they felt already England was getting too authoritarian. And that struggle was more religious than political, but they remembered it very well. And one of the things that the Puritans hated was royal soldiers coming into houses, and usually they were looking for a Bible because there was a kind of a Bible the Puritans liked. It was different from the Church of England Bible. And that's a very personal violation of your space. So they just remembered that. They loved their homes. They loved to quote back to English authorities that The famous legal phrase, a man's home is his castle, that comes from around the time the Puritans are coming over. And today, the Fourth Amendment, very important amendment about preventing unreasonable search and seizure, it's only going to get more important with AI and police needing to see cell phones. That amendment can be traced back to an incident in Boston in 1766 when there was a kind of a riot in the streets of the North End when a man refused to open up his house to an English inspector because he didn't have the right kind of warrant. And they just were very focused on the right to privacy inside your home.
Today, the United States spends more on its military than any other country in the world. We've got over 1 million active duty personnel, but that's a really recent development in our history. What was the attitude toward large standing armies in Britain and in the colonies just before the Revolutionary War?
Well, they were unpopular both in England and in the colonies. And again, to go back 100 years earlier, in the time of the religious arguments, the religious and political, the English Civil War, and even a little before that, there's a feeling that standing armies are a terrible thing for any self-respecting quasi-democratic society, that they inevitably encroach on people's rights and go into their homes, as I was just saying. And so the New Englanders remembered that very well. And when the first occupying force of British comes over to Boston in 1768, they're really unhappy. And it doesn't go well from the beginning. There are constant little standoffs. New Englanders don't like being asked for their papers by strangers. And these were not the best trained troops either. A lot of them were impressed into the British Army. And so they weren't very sensitive to local needs. And even, on the contrary, probably enjoyed lording it over local people who were powerless to push back, except over time it weren't so powerless because little vigilante groups like the Sons of Liberty went around making life uncomfortable for the soldiers. But for 2 very long years, a big contingent of British soldiers was in the middle of the city of Boston, which was a pretty small city back then. It was a city connected to the land by only a narrow neck. So put a couple soldiers on the neck and nobody can get out of Boston. It's almost like an island. And relations were difficult at the beginning, and then they just got worse. The British burned a lot of Bostonian possessions because they got cold in the winter. So they'd go into houses and take furniture, burning books, kind of a sacrilegious thing for a Bostonian. And then the culmination of this first occupation is the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770, when it's just a standoff. There'd been hundreds of these standoffs with locals sort of yelling nicknames and taunts to a group of soldiers. And it was a cold day, so there was snow and ice, and they started throwing snowballs at the soldiers, and they shot back and killed 5 people. And that was a really big deal. The English actually withdrew the soldiers because it was just an unmanageable situation. So that occupation ended after the massacre, and some good things happened. As mad as the Americans were, they had a fair trial. It's one thing when a murder or some kind of physical injury is sustained. That's a crime in any society. But then when the perpetrator has official power and is immediately pardoned by the state that he works for, that's a kind of second problem where you feel like there's just no accountability. And after the Boston Massacre, Bostonians did very well. They allowed a legal trial to happen, a fair legal trial, and John Adams, who was on the side of the Patriots, defended the British soldiers and got them mostly off of all the charges. So that showed the law still working in Boston. But a few years later, there's a second occupation, and it's even worse than the first one.
You mentioned when you were talking before that the Sons of Liberty were making things uncomfortable for the British soldiers. What does that actually mean? And what was the day-to-day experience of the occupation, either in the late 1760s or in the mid-1770s?
Well, in the first of the two occupations, in 1768 to 1770, they couldn't do that much. The British had way more weapons, and they were an army. Sons of Liberty are just little groups of men meeting in bars and telling each other, I just saw a sentry over there 10 minutes ago. It's sort of gossip, and, they can push back a little bit. And there were some minor acts of vandalism that I mentioned in my article of dropping a decapitated sheep's head into a carriage belonging to a Tory Bostonian. And this taunting, yelling of insults, but that's not the same thing as fighting a real war. I think there were some barroom brawls too, but again, that's not equal sides. But then in 1774 and 5 and 6, it's more serious because the Bostonians have been thinking about it. They've got a lot of weapons, gunpowder, hidden in houses and buildings out in the countryside around Boston. And the British have partial knowledge of these gun depots. And, that's beginning to look like a small army is getting ready to fight a bigger. They're more equal. And it's like in, other tense situations I can think of, like in Northern Ireland in the 70s, the search for the weapons of the other side was always very fraught with tension. The IRA had weapons, and the British Army, the paramilitary guys, were always trying to find these weapons. And it's more like that in the 1770s, and that's how Lexington and Concord happened. That's considered the beginning of the American Revolution, and it was an effort by the British soldiers. Thomas Gage is the governor and the commander. He heard that there was a weapons supply, a depot in Concord, and they wanted to go out and grab all the gunpowder and the guns. And the Sons of Liberty, being smart and watching where the soldiers were, that's the legend of Paul Revere. And William Dawes, the other guy, and the lights in Old North Church, and signaling to the countryside they're coming. So that's getting to be like guerrilla warfare.
Mm. And this is, as you're just saying, the kind of spark that lights the powder keg of the American Revolution. There's this idea of a duty to resist immoral laws and commands. Can you talk a little bit about how that idea really is in our founding DNA?
It's really in New England's founding DNA, for sure. And Boston especially. Rhode Island's a little different, slightly higher presence of Quakers down there. And Rhode Islanders often just want to be left alone to run their perhaps illegal businesses, whereas in Massachusetts it was a point of principle that we like our right to govern ourselves. We take it very seriously. We don't want to be pushed around by kings or the generals they send over. We remember stories from our grandfathers and great-grandfathers who founded Massachusetts that they stood up bravely to the troops in their own way. So throughout a pretty long time, Boston's founded in 1630, and then these tensions are in the 1770s. So it's 140 years. It's a long time, but they're passing down these legends, and the legends are reinforced by the ministers and the town officials, and they're really all bound together. Religion is so central to the idea of living in a Massachusetts town that the minister of the local congregational church on the village green is an important civic official as well as a religious official. And one of them was a guy named Jonathan Mayhew, who in 1750 gave a pretty incendiary speech about how if the British tell us to do something goes against our conscience, not only do we have the right to disobey, we must disobey. It's getting to be close to Martin Luther King and Gandhi, that an immoral government telling us to do an immoral thing must be resisted by a people of conscience. So they take that very, very seriously. And Mayhew's, he's just a guy in the middle of the 18th century, but each statement like that leads to the next one. So in 1761, well before the revolution starts, there's a famous legal argument in Boston. A guy named James Otis, who is an inspiration to John Adams. They all, each one leads to the next. He gives a long and impassioned argument against these warrants of dubious legality called writs of assistance, saying you can't just come into our houses and with a quickly drawn up writ of assistance that isn't properly, you haven't submitted it to a judge. We don't know what you're looking for. We don't know the source of this information. And often to get a good warrant, a soldier would have to say who the informant was who told them there was some whiskey stored in this guy's basement. And so naturally, the Bostonians wanted to know who the informant was so they could go beat him up, So there's just tensions on all sides. And each level of, each period of New England resistance made the next one possible.
So we've been, going back and forth between the revolution and the present day, although, mostly talking about the revolution or the years just before it. So, obviously there's a temptation right now to historicize current events and compare them to the occupations in Boston in the 18th century. So you're a historian. What sort of caution would you advise here? And how can knowledge of the history inform the moment that we're living through now?
Well, you're right to interpret that I had Minneapolis on my mind as I wrote about Boston in the 1760s and 1770s. I had no intention of writing that piece, but the day of the big snowstorm a couple weeks ago was the day that Alex Preddy was killed. Mm-hmm. And we began to see it over and over again from different vantage points. And I just had a deep feeling of unease and anger, and I wanted to do something. And with historical training, it's just maybe not the most effective response, but it was what came naturally to me. And I had studied the American Revolution a lot at Harvard in grad school. And I'd walked the trails, even before Harvard, walked the Freedom Trail. I grew up not too far away. And so that was exciting as a kid to come in. And so it was sort of in my own DNA, this idea of resistance to a distant and clueless authority. And as I saw not just the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, but the incredible courage of the ordinary people of Minneapolis, I thought that too is like Boston. And they're all communicating. They're like meeting on corners and saying, I just saw something over here. It's civic action, it's very brave civic action. And so the piece just came to me. It came very quickly. I had a few history books lying around. I consulted, but it was probably done in 4 hours or so, and I sent it to the Globe and they accepted it. So it was a very nice writing experience for me. But you're right to also say that no two historic episodes are identical. We're in 2026. It's more than 250 years after both occupations of Boston. And those two were not identical to each other. So Boston was a much smaller city than Minneapolis is. It was dealing with foreign troops. In Minneapolis, we're dealing with fellow Americans, which, adds to the tragedy in a way. So I tried to point out a few of the differences too. But then even as I did that, I thought, it's not really that different because English and New Englanders thought of themselves as kind of cousins. They weren't that foreign to each other. So even in that way, I thought it was somewhat similar. And there was a very lively online discussion in the pages of the Boston Globe. So I think, got people, some people didn't agree with me at all. A lot of people did. But I just think it's good for us to be talking. We're going into our 250th year as a nation, and we need to understand where we come from. And I was saying we come from a strong dislike of standing armies occupying cities. But ideally, we'll have arguments, respectful arguments on both sides as we get through what's probably going to be a pretty hard year.
I want to ask you about more recent history, some history to which you were a witness yourself, because your time in the White House as senior advisor and speechwriter for President Clinton spanned the years after public outrage over the behavior of federal law enforcement officers during the standoffs at Ruby Ridge in Idaho and the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. So in 1995, a Senate subcommittee report called for reform in the FBI's rules of engagement and called the Ruby Ridge rules unconstitutional and a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So I guess my question is, how did we get from there, where there was pretty widespread and even bipartisan condemnation of federal overreach and heavy-handed action at Ruby Ridge and Waco, to what's happening now in Minneapolis, and the point where, despite the outrage about it, there is still a substantial portion of the country that is completely on board with it.
Yep. This is an issue that's not going away. It's very much with us now. And I think if we want to be honest with ourselves, we have to admit there have been violent people in the margins since the writing of the Constitution, the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, people who did not like the idea of even the very modest central government we were creating in the 1780s and 90s. There were Americans even then who were outraged by it. And there have been left-wing mobs and right-wing mobs protesting the federal government or state governments ever since. What happened in the 90s, you're right. In the early 90s, there was a feeling of profound anger on the right against government overreach. What turned it around pretty dramatically in the middle of the 90s was the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which took it way too far in the other direction. This was an act of terrorism. I think that word absolutely applies. Killed over 100 people, including small children, just because he was mad at the federal government. And that clearly could not be allowed to stand. That's not an acceptable form of political expression of your beliefs. And I think Bill Clinton did a good job talking about it in a way that explained why violence is unacceptable. And that did, I think, tamp down some of that anger at the beginning of the 1990s. But we saw it throughout the teens. I mean, it's happened a lot. The Tea Party was not exactly violent, but it was certainly angry over tax issues. Then we saw pretty significant protests every time an African American was killed, which happened way too many times in the last 15 years. But George Floyd, I think, being the most serious example of people went into the streets that was an act of local police work, not the federal government. But there was vivid anger on the left, which was followed only 6 months or so later with whatever you want to call January 6th, which is still sitting there like a festering wound in our recent memory. But now another flip has happened, because it's the left now, not the right, that is angry over the ICE raids in Minneapolis. And I'm sure there are other ICE raids coming. I think this is only a temporary Christmas truce we're in, and much more is coming.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this has been Colloquy. This podcast is an extension of the school magazine of the same name. You can find a transcript of the show, as well as past episodes, at the Harvard Griffin GSAS website, gsas.harvard.edu/colloquy-podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please rate the show on Apple or Spotify, or like it on YouTube so that others can find it as well. And be sure to follow us on those channels so you'll never miss a conversation. Our theme music is from the Boston-based band Francine. Check out their other tracks at www.francine.info. I'm Paul Massari. See you next time.